Hello, welcome to Chester Box, the podcast from the Diocese of Chester. On Saturday, the 15th of October, around 60 women attended what was the 9th Annual Women's Voices Conference, and 5 speakers were invited to share their different perspectives on the Bible. We're going to bring you all 5 of those talks as part of a series on this podcast, and we begin with Dr. Eve Parker, who is the Director of Global Mission at USPG and author of Trust in Theological Education. Just before we hear Eve's talk, here's a short message from the Bishop of Chester, Mark Tanner.
So my name's Bishop Mark and you're here with me right in the centre of Chester. I've been in the diocese a couple of years, and one of the things that we have the opportunity to do right now is to stop and to consider what is it that God is calling us to do in order that we can be the best news that we can possibly be in our communities. So we're running this vision process. All the details are on the website. We'd love you to come along to one of the cafes or to send in thoughts, to answer questions, to engage with what we're doing, because we believe that Jesus is the best news for the communities of Cheshire, of the Wirral, of the whole Diocese of Chester. And we'd love you to be involved in the process that we have going now to help us discern the way forward.
Chester Box.
That was Bishop Mark Tanner telling us a little about the vision process. If you want more details, please go to chester.anglican.org/vision. Right, here's Dr. Eve Parker talking to the Women's Voices Conference.
Jin Jinyan Asadi. Jin Jinyan Asadi. Woman, life, freedom. Woman, life, freedom. These are the words that are being chanted by women and girls on the streets and in the schools of Iran, as women demand their right to choose how to exist, how to live, and how to dress. But why must it take the battle cries for liberation and the murder of young women to get the international media to witness that those who hold the power are guilty of oppression, silencing, and control? Why in this country must it take the murdered body of a woman buried in the woods at the hands of a police officer to make people take to the streets and to make us realize that there are issues of power, trust, and misogyny in our societies, religions, and institutions of power? Why must it take the uncovering of the bodies of Indigenous dead children under Catholic mission schools in Canada, or the rise of abuse cases in the Church of England and other denominations, to make us realize that there are issues of violence, spiritual abuse, colonialism, and inequality in our church institutions and our mission histories? There is an epidemic of violence against women in this country and around the world. And such violence is often met with a culture of indifference and impunity. As I was gathering my thoughts for what I would say today about violence against women and the silencing of women, I was also preparing to give a lecture on how as Christians we understand Eve, the first woman. And as I reread the language, the theology, and the philosophy of our church fathers, I saw in the wisdom of those who have gone before us and determined our doctrines and of the holy institutions that we work in, I saw in their theology, the foundations of doctrine, a justification for violence against women. From naming women as the devil's gateway, ascribing vanity and envy to Eve and her daughters, saying of women that they are dead and condemned, to Oregon, who promises that God will shamelessly say to women, "You have the face of a harlot. You have made yourself shameless to all. And so you will be punished, therefore, like a harlot, and your sons will be ordered to be prepared for the slaughter." And let us not forget, of course, the great church father Augustine, who sees no sense for God creating women other than to make Eve his helper for the sake of bearing children. And so to escape the lecture writing and the shaming from the church fathers, I switched on the news. And in the news, there was about a woman who had been raped and the police had dismissed her account of what had happened. In fact, the police had actually helped to develop an excuse for the perpetrator, and the survivor was now demanding justice. Yet she would not have the opportunity to have her testimony heard before the courts. So the woman's experience, her trauma, and her knowledge, her testimony, would not be heard. She would not have justice. So over 1,500 years after the Church Fathers stated that women are deceitful, gateways to hell, it appears women are still being blamed for the senseless and shameful acts of mankind, and their testimonies are still being silenced. Because imagine being told that no one will believe you. Or imagine being told that you don't know what you're talking about, or that what you think is true isn't true. Because this is what it is to have knowledge denied. Now, the philosopher Miranda Fricker has observed that to be degraded as a knower is to be degraded as a human being. And so central to our humanity is our capacity to know. The injustice of sexual violence and all violence against women is often compounded by what philosophers call epistemic injustices. In other words, knowledge injustice. This is where a wrong is done to people as knowers, and this is something I want to give some focus to today. Because one common kind of epistemic injustice is testimonial injustice, where a person's credibility as someone with knowledge to convey is discounted because of a certain prejudice, i.e. a prejudice because she's a woman. So children, for example, regularly suffer from testimonial injustice. And this has been extremely visible with children's historic abuse narratives in the church, as children who suffered sexual abuse at the hands of a priest, for example, and found the words to express what had happened to them were often greeted with disbelief, even by their families. For how could a priest, a man of Christ, do such things? The child must be telling tales or misunderstanding. Thus, the child's testimony was dismissed, and the child was enjoined to silence, and even made to feel ashamed of himself or herself for making such an accusation. And the same can often be said for the testimonies of women who have experienced violence and abuse. In the face of such violence against women and testimonial injustice, I actually want to somehow bring the discussion today to the subject of joy at some point, which might, as I said, seem shocking, given that there is so much to lament in the world, to the extent that we must actually ask ourselves if it's possible to truly live authentic Christian joy in the face of this untold suffering. When, to quote Psalm 11, the foundations are destroyed, so what can the righteous do? But before I get to thinking about joy, I wanted to dwell in lament. Lament in the broken bodies of women, as lament is something that gives us the space to dwell in such destruction. Because when we hear of stories of violence and atrocities against women by those who we have been told we are meant to be able to put our trust in, we can sometimes react with instant shock, questioning, how can humans commit such violence against one another? Who would do such a thing? And sometimes, as we've heard, there'll be protests, but often there is a sense of indifference. Is this because we've become so normalized to the horrors of abuse and violence? Or is it because to dwell too long in the horrors of humanity that it can become too much for us to think on, at the fear of becoming hostages to despair? Perhaps it's even a lack of solidarity with those who suffer. Yet, as Christians, we are taught to lament in the injustices on earth, just as the biblical laments do, to name what is wrong, name the evils, and resist such evils, and in doing so, express eschatological hope by bearing witness to what should not be, and therefore what should be and what will be, according to God's promises. However, when our churches develop missional strategies, often they do not think to begin with lament or root our mission in lament and brokenness. Lament in the face of violence against women is often overlooked. We are perhaps too quick to jump to joy, the joy of the resurrection and the hope of the kingdom, but this can often come at the expense of lament and suffering, the suffering in the crucifixion. For Brueggemann, the loss of lament in our churches is due to the inability to face suffering and embrace negativity in our modern world. For Hall, it's a problem of Western society that the pathos of our condition is not that we have failed. The pathos of it is that we cannot bring ourselves as a people to contemplate our failure. So if lament expresses our agonized awareness that this world desperately needs transforming and that we still await God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, then the loss of lament signals a loss of passion for social justice and ultimately a failure to wrestle with God in pain, mourning and protest about the grief and violence on earth. So where the indecency, because lament is indecent, is removed from the missions of the church, then the church fails to confront oppression. As lament presents us with this way of knowing that is unique, it is the cries of the oppressed that call on us to participate in a revolution, to resist the systems that subjugate, to join the chants of Jin, Jinyan, Asadi, woman, life, freedom. So lament is then political. It's about taking sides. It's about responding to the epistemological silencing of the tears of the downtrodden. And yet, as I've said, our mission strategies are so often so quick to jump to joy. Joy in the promise of a glorious kingdom to come. But such joy is a strange thing, is it not? Sometimes it can be used to sedate the hopelessness in suffering and therefore mask oppression in the here and now. So hope and joy can then save us from our responsibility in thinking about the narratives of struggle and oppression and what we have to do with such struggle and oppression. Especially if it's a joy that is not rooted in lament and does not sing out the struggles of resistance, it can stop us from asking critical questions about our own role in such struggle. When I think about hope and the promise of joy in the context of lament, I often come back to the words of a Dalit woman in India who I met a few years ago. She'd been forced into sex work from childhood. She'd suffered from caste discrimination, poverty, and AIDS. The church castigated her for her sex work that she relied on to feed her children. And she asked this question. She said, what hope is there for me? And the truth is, her children suffer from malnutrition. She's dying from AIDS. The church won't let her be baptized because she's a sex worker. She then lives in the realities of poverty, sexism, religious judgment, violence against women, caste discrimination, and disease. So what hope is there for her? Where is her joy? To speak of joyful hope in the resurrection in light of such grave suffering apparent in this woman's narrative of struggle is to do a grave disservice to the cross of Christ and the ambiguity of hope and joy in the midst of such violent realities. Because we cannot, and we should not, let the joy of hope or joy be a gateway to indifference, as our missional efforts must overcome the lack of consciousness and solidarity in the world today. So what words of joy can we offer this woman? We can hope for her. We can pray for her, pray she finds solace in God's grace. But does that not just liberate us from asking critical questions about what role we play in her story, about how we uphold the systems that have condemned her to the margins, that have silenced her and her knowledge based upon her experiences of life and suffering? So you see, notions of joy in the context of lament, if not rooted in resistance, can be ways of maintaining oppression and nullifying our need to act. In the words of Miguel de la Torre, hope and joy become a way of domesticating those who are suffering. In the spirit of hope, we may often stay silent in the face of oppression, in the hope that by not asking questions or fighting against injustice, that we don't ourselves face the wrath of the oppressor. So why is the knowledge and experience of suffering relevant to our understandings of God and mission? Why might the silencing of this woman's knowledge have an impact on how we understand mission and the future of the church? I was speaking to a good friend of mine recently who is a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda. And he said to me that after you witness the horrors of genocide, the massacre of 1 million people in 3 months, mass rape, looting, and slaughter, that you no longer fear death. That you no longer fear death. He said that, in fact, you just hope for a quick death because you become resigned to the struggle and so you're already dead. There are atrocities that humanity has committed against one another that are almost too painful, too unthinkable to talk about, particularly in the context of contemplating God and the mission of the church in the face of violence against women. And yet, it was inside a church building that more than 1,000 Tutsis were rounded up in the province of Kibungo, Rwanda, and massacred. In this church building, hundreds of bodies of women and children, had been left where they were found, tangled skeletons in a space of worship, where priests turned on priests with machetes and guns. We cannot ignore the tangled skeletons in churches, the murdered bodies in gas chambers, the corpses of indigenous children under mission schools, and the violence committed daily against women and people of color. These are narratives of silenced lament that I believe must shape the future of the church and her mission, because we have all at some point been complicit in this silencing. So when we talk about joy in the midst of such lament, we have to do so in terms of solidarity and resistance. In other words, joy cannot be about jumping to the resurrection of Christ. We've got to dwell in the struggle of the cross and ask ourselves, what do the tortured bodies of genocide teach us about God? How do we do theology and mission in the knowledge that people do not fear death because of the atrocities, pain, and suffering they see here on earth? And no, this is not because of an expectation of some glorious kingdom to come, but rather because nothing can be worse than seeing a loved one slaughtered before you, than seeing a woman being brutally raped, than living in the fear of what pain might come your way. So death is death. What is there to fear when you've beheld such terrors on earth? We cannot then talk about joy before addressing what it is to lament and ask ourselves, how do we contemplate God when God's deemed silent in the midst of the struggles of the oppressed, in situations of hopelessness, in the midst of these overlapping unjust structures and the intersections of racism, classism, ethnic discrimination, and sexism? Yes, a sense of hopelessness grips the soul, but we can't respond with simplistic solutions of superficial joy. I want them to journey, through a story of silenced lament and ultimate joylessness. I did warn people beforehand that this would not be happy, but I will bring some joy, hopefully. The story I want to talk about is the story of the tortured concubine in Judges 19. It's a story of violence against women and epistemic injustice, where a woman's body is brutally raped and murdered, and so too is her knowledge and testimony. You see, the Bible for me is central to how we contemplate God in the midst of violence against women, as I have to agree with the words of the liberation theologian Alan Bosak, who said that every time he reads the Bible, he becomes more radical. And it's very much the same for me. Every time I look at Scripture, I become more radical in my faith and my thirst for justice. And every time I read this text, I become more angry. Angry not just at the violence committed against this nameless woman, but angry that this story of silenced lament continues to be made real in the world today, where violence against women is perpetrated and silenced. This is a narrative of hopelessness and lament that is void of joy, but one that ends with a message that I believe we need to hear today. A message that I believe is the only way we can witness a just sense of joy, where joy becomes an act of resistance and solidarity. The text ends with the words that must become a battle cry for future justice in the missions of the church. And these words are, consider it, take counsel, and speak out. Judges 19 describes the violent rape and murder of a woman described as a concubine, who is silenced throughout. The story that unravels ends horrifically for this woman. She attempts to escape from the Levite man and goes to her father's house. However, the Levite persuades her to come back to him, and we are to assume she accepts. However, given her father so willingly welcomes the man into his home, the woman's choice in the matter seems of little consequence. Eventually, the man leaves with the woman, his servant, and donkeys, and they seek shelter on their travels, They rely on the hospitality of a man from Ephraim who was residing in Geba, who welcomes them and feeds them. But while they were enjoying themselves, a group of men from the city surrounded the house, banging on the door. The men threatened to rape the Levite, but the owner of the house refuses to allow this to happen and says, "Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Ravish them and do whatever you want to them, but against this man do not do such a vile thing." The men grabbed the concubine, they gang-raped her, abused her through the night until the morning. Her body, though, could not take any more pain and suffering. She dies on the doorstep of the house that her master had been welcomed into, and she's murdered in the most violent of ways. The Levite man throws the corpse of her body onto the back of his donkey, and when he reaches his home, he takes a knife, dismembers her, chopping up her tortured corpse into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sending her throughout the territory of Israel. The text ends with the words, "Consider it, take counsel, and speak out." Here in Judges 19, we read of an atrocity committed against the body of a woman. And bodily acts are theological acts that reveal secrets about God. Even the most indecent bodily acts offer profound insights into society, religion, power, and our knowledge and understanding of God. Yet disembodied theologies appear to dominate Christianity and the study of theology. And this contradicts what feminist epistemologies have held to be true, that knowledge is situated and varies across different locations, and that gendered power structures within society impact knowledge production. So you might think then that this is a strange text to talk about when we're thinking about mission, particularly, as I say, when my intention is to end with a note offering joy in light of lament. But my point again is this: joy can mask ignorance and indifference in mission, and if it fails to witness the atrocities on earth and the realities of violence against women, and the silent lament of the oppressed. And unless we, to re-quote Judges 19, consider it, take counsel, and speak out, our joy risks masking indifference. There is no mention of God in this story, and yet here it is in our sacred scriptures. Miguel de la Torre asks the question, how can the Creator God be so invisible during the troubling times in which we live? Times filled with unbearable life-denying trials and tribulations. So where is God in this woman's story? This story of horror, a narrative of gendered violence, torture, abuse, xenophobia, and gang rape. A tale of silence, lament, a story told by male bodies that appears to be intended as a lesson for male bodies and ends with male lament. But what of the woman's lament? She is not given a voice. Where is the humanity in this story? The woman's narrative enables us to engage with what Kandungole has referred to as a theopraxis of lament. A theopraxis of lament, where the reader enters into internal logic in order to learn and be transformed. As reading Judges 19 in the context of epistemic and testimonial injustice of this nameless concubine enables us to give voice to similar experiences today. It enables us to call for radical change in both our theology and our praxis. For Tribble, it's a tale between male power brutality and triumphalism, and female helplessness, abuse, and annihilation. For most Christian interpreters who've been influenced by the male bias in reading scripture, the world of the concubine is rendered invisible in the text. It's only in rape and death that she becomes visible as an object to be manipulated and abused by the powerful. But her death, though, represents a grave testimonial injustice where she's unable to voice her struggles and truth. She's not deemed credible, and she is dehumanized in the process. Such testimonial injustice is also apparent in dominant discourses of theology and Bible studies and biblical hermeneutics, where structural biases against certain groups exist, where their voice is not taken seriously, where they're not deemed credible in interpreting and understanding Scripture and God. So in Judges 19, we witness the impact of such structures in the Levite man's response. For example, he remains concerned throughout about his own ill treatment, and the inhospitality he received, as opposed to the violent rape and murder of the woman. He even continues to violate the voiceless body of the corpse of the woman by dismembering her. The dismembering then becomes this attempt to erase her and her memory of a crime that was first, in his opinion, directed against him. However, the very fact that this story exists as a sacred text makes it relevant to how we understand narratives of the oppressed today, because when we center the epistemology or the knowledge and experiences of those who have been raped and violated, instead of silencing such truths in Christian theology, we come to learn and unlearn the truth of the dangers of violence, of patriarchy within the Christian faith. The concubine's brutal murder also forces us to consider the ways in which her knowledge was murdered. In life, she could not speak her truth, and in death, she is dismembered by her oppressor, and her body, through the dismemberment and sending out to the territories of Israel, is used to tell her oppressor's version of events. Yet the truth is that even if the woman had survived the horrors of the violence inflicted against her, who is to say her word, her truth, or her embodied suffering would have been heard or trusted by the powers that be? Her knowledge about the evils of societal violence and gendered persecution would likely not have been given a platform to be heard, as is often the case when women try to share their testimonies of abuse. The author of the text attempts to dismiss her worth from the outset, presenting her as an adulteress who runs away from her forgiving master. And this same technique is used today to dismiss the experiences of rape and trauma survivors, where their characters are assassinated, presented as indecent whores, troublesome liars, in order to discount their worth before the courts. So as we reread this text of Judges 19, it enables us to see the concubine's experiences, her silenced oppression, and ask, why is this text of terror sacred? Who is this nameless woman? And how can the violence inflicted against her and her story be heard in order to inform our contemplations on God today? I wanted to give attention to this story so that we can enter it, so that we can learn from it, so that we might consider the systems of evil apparent in this narrative. Systems of patriarchy, xenophobia, violence against women, and racism, systems that we must dismantle. And the weapon, I want to argue, we can use to do so can be one of communal joy, but only if such joy is shaped by resistance. And this is where I come to this notion of joy in the midst of lament, but a joy that is communal. Now, this notion of communal joy as resistance is central to Black theologies of liberation, where the personal, political, and spiritual become interconnected, where Black joy and Black pain are held together before God in worship, lament, protest, and hope. And such communal joy of resistance is actually apparent in the songs of resistance that was used during the slavery in the USA, where Black people wrote and performed songs of resistance, where they reach into the inner recesses of their suffering in order to protest before God in lament, where every tone is a testimony at this point against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from the chains of oppression. So this is a different kind of joy. This is not a superficial joy. This is a communal joy of resistance. This is a joy that is undead, unchained, and fearless. It is a joy that dances in the face of armed officers, for example, sings in the presence of death, and shouts down systems of terror. It is the spirit of liberation. Such joyful resistance is needed as we strive to understand the world in order to change it. So when we enter the theopraxis of lament in the woman's story in Judges 19, such joy forces us to ask critical questions such as, what might this narrative of silence lament mean for us today, especially for masculinity in the context of mission? What does it mean to be a man in a missiological sense when women are being butchered, when women do not feel safe to walk down the street, when women are being assaulted and murdered by police officers, when violence against women is the norm, when in the UK, even women MPs have to think about how they dress so they don't get accused of being temptresses and thereby deserving of male oppression? The hope of the story of the concubine lies in its inclusion in our sacred scriptures. The very fact that our canons include this woman's narrative is vital for the future of mission, because we know God wants her story to be heard and all those whose names and narratives we can put to it, and that of the concubines. So consider it, take counsel and speak out. These words speak what it is to lament in mission. As we lament, we open ourselves up to look at the situations we find ourselves in and our own complicity in them. So when we name the horrors committed against the woman, we do not move on. We respond, we speak out. And joy is then found in the communal lament of resistance, in the solidarity that we can, in the words of Joan Martin, enable daily sabotage, subversion, and protection against the internalization of dehumanization. When we give voice to narratives of hopelessness, to the experiences of the oppressed in mission, it becomes clear that we must become rebels, because it is the systems of power that oppress. And so the missionary who wants joy in the face of lament must actually become a revolutionary, a rebel against the systems that deny freedom. In Judges 19, there appears to be no joy for the woman. There is no solidarity, just dehumanization. There is the temptation then for women scholars to suggest this horror text is dangerous to missional strategies. However, to do so does a disservice to all those whose laments have been silenced, to all such narratives in the here and now that appear void of joy. The anti-slavery campaigner and women's rights activist Sojourner Truth once said, "I will not allow the light of my life to be determined by the darkness around me." These are words of resistance in the midst of lament. We owe such resistance to the woman in the text. The test of joy in mission is therefore whether it is life-giving or death-dealing. Life-giving joy is rooted in resistance for the oppressed. It is the practice of joy that infuses the community with a hopeful vision for the future. It is affirmation for the struggles of those whose laments have been silenced. It is consciousness raising. It is contagious. It is fueled by the justice of Christ on the cross. So the joy of resistance is an active joy, a joy that seeks to dismantle, to disturb, to disrupt the ongoing systems of oppression. It is the work of the collective, the souls that have witnessed the struggles of the downtrodden and that seek to rebuild a world that gives agency to those who have been denied of love and justice. So the joy that follows the horror story is the communal joy of resistance. It is the struggle. It is the speaking out. It is the chants of Jin Jinyan Asadi, woman, life, freedom. This is not a superficial joy then rooted in Christian mission. This is a joy rooted and responsive to lament, a communal act of solidarity that dances, that sings, that protests in the knowledge that true community exists only at the foot of the cross. A joy rooted in hope that is neither sentimental nor vapid. It does not give up on God or us, that refuses to believe that evil and suffering and sorrow and hatred are God's final words to us in a world that is spinning top down with war and violence. So yes, this joy might become weary, might even become disgusting, may even become impatient and may disappoint us, but this is a joy that can be exhausting because it is not shallow. It is impatient because it is part of the struggle. It is a joy that can bring laughter in community as well as tears in solitude, and it is relentless in the face of evil. It pieces together the corpse of the concubine and says never again. It holds the dead woman's hand and laments for her, and joins the hands of all sisters and brothers who wish to join the struggle. It is tolerant, loving, and creative. This is a joy that vibrates a beat of loyalty, solidarity, camaraderie, and unity, that enables the communal dance at the foot of the cross. This is a joy that ignites the battle cries of protest and the tears of resistance, and does not give up in the face of evil. It does not rely on logic to survive. It does not clap to the soulless tune of individual superficial joy rooted in the greed of capitalism. This is the joy of the collective. Thus, communal joy of resistance that resonates with the words of James 2:14, that faith minus works is useless, it is dead. Well, joy is useless if it does not dance to the drumbeat of protest in the face of oppression. So consider it, seek counsel, and speak out.